A very good morning, everyone. I see we have quite a number of attendees that have joined already. I think we'll give everyone about 2 more minutes as we're also waiting one of our panelists. Okay, great. I think we have all our panelists, so we can begin. Once again, a very good morning to you all. My name is Leanne Govinsamy, and I'm the head of the Corporate Accountability and Transparency Program at the Center for Environmental Rights. I really must thank you for taking the time out of your extremely busy days to join us this morning. I think even in these extremely challenging times, it's always good to have an opportunity to connect with you all, to share some fresh perspectives on the work that we are all doing. And we certainly hope that we are able to generate and discuss some new ideas around the role of public finance in advancing a just energy transition, and by doing so, advancing environmental and climate justice. As the invitation has indicated, today we launch our Financing Fairly case study, a report that looks at the role of the IDC in funding Mcmining. I will add into the chat a link to the report, and I will just go through some of the program items for today as well. Okay, so we will kick off today with some introductory remarks from Kees Kodde, project lead at Fair Finance International. And I will add the bios of all our panelists into the chat as we proceed. We will then have a presentation from Dayan Halim, researcher at the CER and author of this very exciting report, followed by a panel discussion. And our panel discussion will begin by a reflection on some key questions from Robert Krause, who's a researcher in the Environmental Justice Program at the Center for Applied Legal Studies, followed by some reflections by David Chizumba, who is an environmentalist with a passion for community engagement and part of Save Our Limpopo Valley Environment. And then very excitingly closing off with Alia Kaji and her reflections as a public finance campaigner at 350.Africa. Really kind of reflecting on the role of civil society going forward in respect of public finance organizations and institutions. I want to hand over to Kees, but I think before we do so, it would be remiss of me to not offer condolences on behalf of CER and the environmental justice space on the passing of Wally Schultz. David, I know, a colleague, a longtime supporter of Solve. We do offer our condolences and recognize the immense work that he has done in this space. So to you, David, and colleagues, we do recognize the sadness of the moment as well. Kees, can I hand over to you for your introductory remarks as part of Fair Finance International?
Sure, thank you, Leanne. I want to offer my condolences as well, David. I'm very sorry to hear this. So my name is Kees Kodde. I am here representing Oxfam Novib from the Netherlands and Fair Finance International. And we are very grateful that we have been able to support this initiative and this case study. I will tell you a little bit more about Fair Finance International. We were founded in 2014. We are an independent worldwide civil society network of over 100 civil society organizations initiated by Oxfam, working to strengthen the commitment of all financial institutions to act on and adhere to social, environmental, and human rights standards. We are active in 14 countries in Asia, Europe, and Latin America. Every day, financial institutions make investment decisions that impact the lives and the livelihoods of millions of people. Financial institutions provide the capital flows that allow powerful corporations to do business, and as such, the financial sector has a crucial role in holding businesses accountable to operate in a sustainable and responsible manner. By influencing the global financial sector to implement more sustainable lending, investments, and asset management policies and practices, we stimulate financial institutions to rethink and reshape their role in society for a positive long-term impact on the lives of many. We do our influencing based on researching both the policies and the practices of financial institutions. For policy assessments, Fair Finance International has an extensive methodology in which we compare the policies of financial institutions with international standards and agreements like the OECD guidelines for responsible business, the Paris Agreement on climate change, and human rights agreements. The same methodology is used across the network to assess and score financial institutions' approach to sustainability across 23 themes, including corruption, human rights, climate change, etc. And these data form the basis of a constructive, fact-based dialogue between our network and the various actors in the financial sector, as well as their regulators, for more responsible and sustainable financial policies and practices. Rankings of banks and institutional investors are reported online by our network. We publicize them in the media, and we use these rankings in public campaigns to spotlight which institutions are leaders and to pressure those that are laggards. This increases transparency and promotes a race to the top amongst financial sector players. The policy assessment methodology was piloted last year together with CER for assessing development finance institutions. And we compared the policies of 6 development finance institutions and multilateral development banks, including the European Investment Bank, the African Development Bank, IDC, DBSA, the Dutch FMO, which is a DFI, and the New Development Bank. However, policies are just words, and often policies are weakened by loopholes and restrictions that limit the scope of the policies. Therefore, Fair Finance International also carries out case studies where we zoom in on a particular controversial sector or project or company, and we research who is financing this problematic project. This approach allows us to investigate where policies are not realized according to the paper version and where policies and practices should be improved. We have achieved good results with this approach. We delivered a range of case studies, for example, showing that European banks are still financing arms producers who were supplying weapons to countries in war, like Saudi Arabia and Yemen. As a result, many investors and banks have now divested from these arms producers. Another example is we carried out a range of case studies showing that European and Asian banks are still financing coal-fired power plants and coal mines. And now what you see is that a range of European and Asian banks are withdrawing from coal, and the coal divestment policies, which in the beginning contained lots of loopholes, are now becoming stricter and stricter. Last year, we published with Fair Finance International case studies about the connection between European banks and investors and deforestation in the Amazon region in Latin America. And we revealed that European investors and banks invested over 20 billion euros in companies that are responsible for deforestation and violations of human rights of indigenous peoples, mainly companies in the agribusiness sector, such as beef, soy, and sugarcane. Since these case studies, European investors are now, and banks are now taking on a much more active role, and they have engaged with the Brazilian government and asked them to strengthen forest protection and human rights policies and not to weaken them. Financial institutions are very powerful, and we want them to use that power to go beyond short-termism and to take into consideration the consequences of our economic model on the long term, on people and planet. I'm very much looking forward to the debate today with you, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Case. And I think, to reflect on one thing that you've said around the fair finance methodology, that it is constructive and fact-based. And I think that's so incredibly important, because right now we as civil society is saying, look, here's a really well-developed methodology, way of working that we've relied on, both in the assessment and now in the case study, to be able to build upon that work. And we're challenging banks kind of based on a very established way of research and engagement. It is important to note at this point that we have invited the Industrial Development Corporation to one, participate in this webinar and provide more detailed feedback on our report. They've not done so, but we remain, as we always do within civil society, ready to engage in a meaningful, constructive way, and in the way in which I think Fair Finance International has done in other regions of the world to bring about really meaningful change. So thank you, Case. I think that was an incredibly important reflection to kind of locate us within this kind of work around public finance. I'd like to now hand over to Dejan. Dejan will present the findings of the report, and there will be an opportunity to raise questions. I really encourage you all use the Q&A or the chat function to raise all of your questions, and we'll make sure we have enough time to be able to answer them. Dejan.
Thanks so much, Leanne. Thanks. Thanks, Leanne and Case, for that introduction. I'm going to get straight into it, and what I'll be speaking to you about is the findings, some of the research that we considered as part of the case study, and also the recommendations that we set out at the end of the case study, which are crucially important. The format of this, this presentation, we're going to look into three issues. Firstly, to unpack the role of development finance institutions in financing sustainable development, and then assessing and interrogating specifically the IDC's ability to assess or to realize sustainable development. And in that, we'll look into its investment in Mcmining, which we show is not necessarily sustainable, and then ask why the IDC fails to support sustainable industrial development. So onto the first issue, I think we'll start with the definition, and sustainable development is development that meets the needs of present generations without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. This definition is incorporated into the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which the IDC has subscribed to, as well as the Constitution of South Africa, the National Environmental Management Act, the National Framework for Sustainable Development. And when you look at it, development in general consists of economic growth and social improvements, which can create jobs, reduce inequality, poverty, and improve welfare, including by realizing some of the social and economic rights within the Constitution. But sustainability implies limitations on the use of environmental resources to preserve them for future generations. And so there are three elements of sustainable development. There's the economic, the social, and the environmental. And all of these must be realized in order to achieve sustainable development. So what are the types of projects and activities that could support this? Well, development projects and activities traditionally include infrastructure. So we're talking about roads, hospitals, schools. But within sustainable development, we're looking at things like reforestation, renewable energy, and environmental goods manufacturing, and so on, and infrastructure to support these things. We're looking also at the development of new industries and value chains, and this is particularly relevant for the IDC. So they might invest in renewable energy value chains, which includes the manufacturing of components and the development of some of these solar and wind-powered plants or farms. It could also include the development of electric vehicle value chains and so on. It may also include innovation and adaptation of existing industries. So here, if it's sustainable, we might consider greening the steel industry or the cement industry, which could have important implications for South African companies and foreign direct investment with companies like ArcelorMittal or PPC cement, and so on. But these sorts of development projects are often large and expensive. They offer relatively low rates of return for private investors, and this is what necessitates public finance. And this is because they're generally public goods, little to no revenues generated, especially in the beginning or only over the long term. And you can think of constructing a road as an example there. But they're also higher risk, which reduces the interest rates for private investors. So public finance and development finance institutions in particular play a vital role in realizing sustainable development because they fund these sorts of activities. And they do this through a couple of mechanisms, which include providing their own capital and finance for these activities. So they directly finance the construction of the renewable energy power plants or of the value chain. But it's especially important that we recognize that they crowd in private investment by de-risking these projects. And this is a mechanism of credit enhancement. So they fulfill a portion of the funding requirements for their investments, or they'll provide a guarantee or insure their investment. And in this way, they draw in private investors who provide the balance of the funding at more acceptable rates of return. So essentially, development finance institutions can make an unattractive investment attractive. And this is positive when we're doing this in sustainable industries, but it's also negative when we're attracting continued private investment into fossil fuel industries, which may be on their way out. So let's look into the IDC specific ability. And the IDC is mandated to fund industrialization in South Africa, and this is in alignment with government's national priorities and objectives. So the IDC Act sets out the mandate. And this is set out in the long title of the IDC Act, and particularly which sets out the purpose, which is to establish new industries and industrial undertakings and the development of existing industries and industrial undertakings. This is also reflected in one of the 8 objects set out in Section 3 of the Act. But some of the other objects might include funding activities as directed by the Minister of Trade and Industry, or leveraging foreign direct investment in South Africa and Southern Africa in order to achieve industrial development. They're guided by industrial policy and public policy. So the National Development Plan, the Special Economic Zones Policy, the Industrial Policy Action Plan, the New Growth Path would indicate which sorts of industries and activities should be funded in alignment with government's objectives and priorities. And for the IDC, their website sets out a list of industries and sectors that they prioritize and that they fund, and this includes things like mining and agriculture, telecommunications, and a few others. So if the IDC were to fund sustainable industrial development within this mandate and given these objects, what would that look like? So if they were funding new industries, the IDC would fund the development of renewable energy manufacturing value chains, for example, or environmental goods and services, or they'd fund research and development into new green technologies. The IDC has done this before, and particularly with Sasol. I mean, so this wasn't green, but when the IDC, when Sasol was looking for an innovative way to create oil out of coal, the IDC provided some funding to support the development of the Fischer-Tropsch process, which Sasol uses today. What we're saying is that they should be applying similar processes today to move away from fossil fuels and into a green future. And the IDC could fund research and development into technologies such as hydrogen technologies, which could be adopted by other players and industries today. The IDC can also fund efficiencies in existing industries through funding climate mitigation, adaptation, and resilience in the industrial undertakings of its clients. So for instance, it could fund the greening of steel technology within ArcelorMittal, which we'll get to later in this presentation, or it could support the greening of the cement industry with PPC cement. It could also leverage FDI to attract capital and technology from abroad, while encouraging skills transfers and localization to support development of local industries. And these are these new and existing industries that I've spoken about. And you can think that there are some positive spaces for the IDC to invest in, and one example would be the Atlantis Special Economic Zone here down in the Cape. So how does the IDC's investment in Mcmining perpetuate development of unsustainable value chains? Well, before we get to that, I think it's important to note that the IDC does fund some sustainable industrial activities in line with its public policy, such as the National Development Plan and IPAP. And this is, you can see this in the funding of companies within the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Program. But it also continues to fund unsustainable activities that keep South Africa locked into fossil fuels with negative and social environmental impacts. And the funding of Mcmining is a key example of this. So some background to Mcmining. Mcmining is a coal mining firm. Its primary listing is Australia, and it's got a secondary listing on the JSE. It's got several projects in Limpopo, which are in the development phase. This includes the Makado project and the Greater Soutspannburg projects. It also has the Vele project in Limpopo, which is currently in care and maintenance. Its only operational mine currently is the Acorns colliery in KwaZulu-Natal. In 2017, the IDC provided a loan to finance the development of the Makado project, which also included a small portion for refurbishment of certain technologies within the Vele colliery. This loan, like we've seen, was a form of credit enhancement, a de-risked investment for other potential financiers, and Mcmining has now had to find other financiers to fill in a certain gap within the funding of this project. The trouble is that this was a particularly risky investment. Mcmining had a history of environmental non-compliance and social and environmental harm, which the IDC should have been aware of before it invested in Mcmining. The Vele colliery was developed in 2010, in the early 2010s. At that stage, Mcmining was Coal of Africa Limited, and I'll let some of the other panelists speak to this in more detail because they've covered it quite significantly and contributed to this part of the report. But at the time when mining commenced, it had commenced without appropriate authorizations. It posed significant water, heritage, biodiversity, air quality, social and environmental impacts that panelists will also speak to. And this led to opposition to the Vele colliery, which in turn led to litigation and severe reputational damage for Coal of Africa. There's a good graph inside the report that we've borrowed from CALS, which shows the correlation between some of these events and negative impacts on Coal of Africa's share price. Also, when mining eventually commenced, it was paused because of non-compliance with certain environmental legislation. It was discovered that the coal quality was poor, and the key off-taker, the Mulilo coal-fired power station, eventually did not go ahead. As a result of all of this, the mine was eventually placed in care and maintenance. The current annual report from Mcmining says that it will likely come out of care and maintenance if the Musina-Makado Special Economic Zone goes ahead, which I'll also come to in a little bit. Mcmining eventually rebranded to focus on its metallurgical coal prospects, hence MC, and this is tied up within the Makado project, which has become its flagship project. But this project has also faced similar legal challenges, similar environmental risks and social harm. But despite these risks, the IDC provided Mcmining with a loan. As a result, Mcmining managed to secure an offtake agreement with ArcelorMittal, who has committed to purchase 85% of Mcmining's coal. It's notable that the IDC is a shareholder in ArcelorMittal too. The second potential offtaker is the Musina-Makado Special Economic Zone. This zone will likely bring the Vele colliery out of care and maintenance due to the presence of a thermal coal-fired plant on Vele, a thermal coal-fired plant within the SEZ that requires the coal produced by Vele. But it could also support the Makado project and the Greater Soutspannburg project because of metallurgical industries within the zone. Notably, it's been reported in the media that the IDC could be a potential funder for companies and projects within MCEZ as well. So, through its investments in the Makado project, the IDC is invested in a value chain in which the Makado project has become a key supplier of coal that could support the local steelmaking and metallurgical industries within ArcelorMittal and MCEZ. So ArcelorMittal, just to look at this company briefly, it relies on coal for steelmaking, and as a result of that, it has the third highest emissions of greenhouse gases in the country. It's been the subject of numerous environmental non-compliances, and it's recently been found criminally liable for some of these non-compliances. It faces climate risks of its own and hasn't performed well in recent years. The Auditor's report in its most recent integrated report raised concern about the company's ability to continue as a going concern. And I mean, of course, if ArcelorMittal is unable to purchase this 85% of coal from the Mercado project, it does question the prospects of that project. Nonetheless, they may rely on Messina Mercado Special Economic Zone, but here there are also numerous social and environmental impacts, which will be spoken about later. This project alone threatens South Africa's ability to meet our nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement and could raise our emissions by 3%. Plans for the project have already been revised due to findings of the environmental impact assessments in order to lower emissions. And this has largely been the result of opposition. And it's interesting that it's the same NGOs and civil society organizations that have opposed the Messina Mercado Special Economic Zone and also the Vele Colliery. So it's interesting to think that we might be seeing similar consequences here. So the crucial issue is that when we look at these investments, it seems that the IDC had focused on the economic rationale. So currently, most of the coking coal we use in South Africa in steelmaking is imported. And if the Mercado project goes ahead, it would support import substitution, localization, cost reductions that could help the steel industry, which we know has been struggling, according to the Steel Industry Master Plan that the DTI has recently released. But it is a risky investment because the coal mining industry has very poor long-term growth prospects. This is due to its damaging environmental, social, and climate impacts, but also a decrease in global reliance on coal. So the question is, did the IDC consider this? Did it consider the social and environmental impacts of the investment, the risks associated with investing in new coal mining, given the long-term threats to that industry? Did it consider the risks associated with these off-takers in MCES and ArcelorMittal in respect of this project and the viability of those off-takers? Because if the IDC did not consider all three dimensions of sustainable development in the investment decision, then this investment would not be sustainable within the definition that we accept under Section 24 of our Constitution. So the question is, why did the IDC fail to support this? And we looked into the IDC's Act and its mandates, and the IDC Act specifically states that every proposal must be considered strictly on its economic merits, irrespective of any other considerations. Now, strictly interpreted, this may exclude social and environmental factors or just overemphasize economic merit. But we know that all legislation, including the IDC Act, must be interpreted in alignment with the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. So at minimum, the IDC must ensure that its investments do not harm, any rights within the Bill of Rights, which includes the right to an environment that's protected for the benefit of present and future generations, and that's not harmful to health. So public policy could then direct investments in towards more sustainable industries. And we see this with the new National Development Plan and the Industrial Policy Action Plan, which encourage investment in sustainable industries. But those policies, as well as the new growth path, also encourage funding of the mining value chain and industrial infrastructure. So there's no concomitant shift away from fossil fuel industries. The IDC could take the social and environmental impacts into account on its own by formulating policies that require it to take these factors into account when making an investment decision. This would align with the Constitution, and it could also support its goal to realize sustainable development within the UN SDGs, which we've already noted that the IDC recognizes, but also the National Development Plan. So we looked into these policies, and this formed the basis of our first report. And we know that the IDC has policies in practice, but we found that they're lacking and they're not available for public scrutiny. So the responsible investment policy, for example, which has been released subsequent to the release of our last report, shows that there's no clear criteria which companies must comply that align with international social and environmental standards. So the responsible investment policy basically sets out 7 types of investments that the IDC will not invest in as a result of ethical concerns. This is how the IDC phrases it. And among them are projects when EIA is not conducted. So in other words, an EIA must be conducted, but the policy doesn't say what should happen after this EIA is conducted. So it's entirely possible that an EIA could be conducted in which we find that the environmental and social impacts outweigh the economic benefits, which is the case of the Musina-Makata Special Economic Zone, and the IDC could still potentially invest, because the policy does not say that it will not invest in those situations or in those circumstances. So we say that there's insufficient criteria around what is considered within the responsible investment policy. Finally, the IDC also has due diligence processes in place. It applies a social and environmental risk rating to its investments, and this forms part of its development scorecard. None of this, however, is publicly available. The social and environmental factors which form parts of the risk rating and as set out in the development scorecard indicate that these factors are scored, but they're not weighed in the assessment against other factors. So the development scorecard considers a range of factors such as economic considerations like job creation potential. It also considers social and environmental risks, but while the social and environmental risks are scored, they're not weighted in the assessment. This is what we've seen in the document, but we haven't had any explanation from the IDC as to what this actually means or whether this is accurate. And as this information is not publicly available, we can't go any further in assessing it. And it's for this reason that we say that the IDC's current policies and practices, if they're the only safeguard, then the prognosis is concerning for the IDC's prospects of funding sustainable development. So finally, what do we recommend? Our first recommendation is that the legislature should review the purpose of the IDC Act to align with sustainable industrial development. This is not new. The Development Bank of Southern Africa's Act specifically committed to sustainable development. The instrument establishing the African Development Bank sets out in Article 1 that it is committed to achieving sustainable development. And we should see similar sort of provisions within the IDC Act and the regulations around the IDC. The second is that the IDC should formulate new investment policies and due diligence guidelines that consider environmental and social factors in addition to economic merit. There's some precedent in this through its responsible investment policies and other policies that it applies. So it's not that it should exclusively consider economic merit as set out in the Act, but it can rely on constitutional imperatives to develop these policies. What is clear is that the current policies are not good enough. And so the third recommendation is that the policies must be consistent with the Constitution, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement, the guiding principles on business and human rights, the Equator Principles, International Labour Organizations conventions, and any other international instruments that South Africa has subscribed to that relate to social and economic standards. And it sounds like a lot, but as Kees just mentioned, when we did the assessments for the first report, we evaluated 6 different DFIs around the world, and many of these DFIs managed to do so. The IDC came last and was the only institution that was unable to do so. Yeah, and I see you coming on. I'm gonna finish up now. So just to rush through this, the Department of Trade and Industry should also take steps to align industrial policy around the need to secure a sustainable future. And what we're saying here is that you can't have the NDP saying that it should do one thing and the NGP saying that something else should happen. All of these policies need to be aligned, and they need to encourage the development of green and sustainable industries and discourage investment in fossil fuels. Parliament has a role to play, and its portfolio committees can exercise oversight over the IDC and its due diligence process and ask about the social and environmental impacts of large investments. Finally, the IDC must be more transparent. It must facilitate access to these policies, the due diligence criteria. It should give us details of the clients and the terms of the agreements so we can assess them. The environmental impact assessments that it's considering should be available online, and the ongoing monitoring reports that it should be conducting should also be available. There shouldn't be a need to file a PIA request in order to get all of this information. And the IDC should reduce its exposure to carbon-intensive industries and fund climate mitigation and adaptation programs of high carbon emitters. This means that the companies that the IDC funds should also reduce their carbon emissions, and the IDC could use frameworks such as the Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosures recommendations to assess these sorts of strategies by companies to reduce their emissions. And it could similarly apply to its own investment practices. And ultimately, it should commit to stop financing fossil fuels. So thank you so much. And I'll hand back to you, Leanne.
Thank you, Dejan, for that really excellent presentation. You know, I'm really hearing you say that the IDC, in order to be a responsible investor, on paper and in practice, needs to kind of make real commitments, and urgently as well, to stop funding fossil fuels, because in as much as it may invest in green hydrogen technology and other sustainable investments, the kinds of investments like into Mcmining and ArcelorMittal is really negatively impacting it and affecting it in a way that is not just about how it conducts its business, but how it is a leader, a public finance institution that really leads the way in terms of advancing sustainable industrial development. Maybe, you know, when we get into the panel discussion and we hear more about the impacts, you know, I can pose some additional questions to you around, you know, the kind of practical steps around consulting with civil society and being more transparent, for example, in negotiating and coming up with these policies that could be maybe something really practical that I guess everyone here could try and take forward. But I will definitely come back to you on those very practical questions. I want to get into our discussion. I see that there are no questions yet. I think everyone's absorbing the information. Thank you, Dejan. I want to get into our panel discussion, starting off with Robert. I'm going to put Robert's bio into the chat and then kick off with some questions. We really are wanting to have a conversation with everyone here, so please do feel free to raise your hand, ask questions, etc. Robert, maybe I can start off, you know, but firstly, I want to say that the work of CALS is reflected in the report that we've done, because it's been so important to be able to unpack the excellent work that CALS and your team, Robert, have done in this particular region. But can you tell us, why is it important to focus on the impacts of coal mining in this particular region of Limpopo?
Thank you, Leanne. And I think the starting point are basically two principles that are either explicitly enshrined in our constitution or are found in the legislation giving effect to it, in particular the main piece of legislation, National Environmental Management Act, and its environmental management principles. The one which I won't really unpack, because being unpacked so ably, it's been discussed, just been to the fore, is sustainable development, including the intergenerational equity and sustainability aspect of it, that must leave, that development must not leave an environment uninhabitable and unsupportive of any kind of human development for the future generations. The other principle, which is a NEMA environmental management principle, is basically the environmental justice distributional equality principle, that when deciding whether development project should occur, amongst other things, it needs to be a project that will ensure a fair distribution of both the kind of economic benefits, but also the costs and of environmental costs, and that should not fall particularly on historically disadvantaged people and communities and classes, which unfortunately in developments often do. So that's the kind of background, some of the background principles that we should, when we look at all these developments, we should interrogate. But more specifically, why oppose coal mining so strongly, and why, in relation to that particular area where Valley Colliery was by what's now called Mcmining, which was Coal of Africa at the time. I'll give a bit of a background about kind of why, for example, the coalition that CAL and Centre for Environmental Rights represented were so strongly opposed to this development. And I suppose there's one factor which looks at actually is the significance of Mapungubwe, the multi-pronged significance of this particular World Heritage Site and National Park. I think many of us here in this call, particularly from have been part of the coalition and CALS and CER, and many of us will know that Mapungubwe is one of the jewels, basically, of African civilization. It was a very influential kingdom. It participated in world trade. It's amazing metalwork and leaves behind, I mean, some of the works it's left behind are still with us. I mean, most famously the golden rhino, but much else. And it was a complex class differentiated state, and it actually has a lot to tell us, in fact, about the development of societies, including, ironically, actually, how because there was some significant climate change towards the end of this kingdom, which was part of one of the factors of its downfall. So I think how we cope with climate change actually can be read from the remains. So but the second aspect of the significance is of the Mapungubwe site is its heritage, but basically cultural and religious significance to many communities, and largely the very communities that have been dispossessed by colonialism and apartheid. So there are multiple communities and groups that still that can trace their lineage to the Mapungubwe kingdom, and from a number of different groups, including Venda van Gona and Hamashete and also Lemba people as well. And for them, it's a very sacred place. It's where ancestors are buried. It has immense cultural and religious significance, including people that were dispersed in part due to colonialism and apartheid that aren't living right there, but the impact is still very direct. And so there's that component of it, and then one looks at obviously the kind of more physical environmental aspect of it, that we're talking about a water stressed area. We're also talking about a national park. Mapungubwe is also a national park in terms of biodiversity as well as its heritage significance. So to allow one of the most invasive, one of the most environmentally harmful forms of development in really immediate proximity to this zone is obviously unacceptable. And I will shortly talk actually as a separate about climate change, which has increasingly come to the fore, and our NDC obligations. But be it as it may, part of it was not only in the coalition, which included a lot of different groups, from environmental groups, public interest lawyers, communities, and local landowners. It was a very diverse coalition. But part of the concern and a big was not just simply this one development of Valley Colliery. It was that basically the precedent setting, the cumulative impact, that once this mine is allowed, then there'll be a flood of applications, many of which will then be successful, and then there's the risk that, particularly without thoroughgoing opposition, that there would have been a kind of a real rapid onslaught of mining that would rapidly transform the area, not for the better, and which would, as often been shown, create actually very limited jobs. These developments usually do for local communities that often aren't very long lived and well paid. So that would have it was that broader impact, and I think the Messina SEZ shows that we were certainly right. I mean, I do think that we succeeded in slowing it down, but that there's still an immense project basically promoted by the Minerals Energy Complex and actually the architects of government and of departments to develop this area along the lines of a coal powered and including coal mining and a heavily extractive centered and carbon intensive centered development zone, which obviously must be opposed, and which, as I think as has already been said, we have obligations under the Paris Agreement of our nationally determined contribution. We cannot contribute to a state of affairs where the global increase in temperature is over 1.5 degrees as recommended. I mean, by the international climate experts. It's kind of the level where there'll still be terrible catastrophic harm, but like put it this way, like if it's beyond that level, the harm would just be unimaginable, really, and this completely flies in the face of these developments, of meeting our contributions, and also just transition to a socially owned, renewable powered and with, where appropriate, different sectors, green industry, agriculture, tourism, where appropriate to the zone, but we're characterized by as much communal control as possible and living wages. But that's the kind of vision, but this type of development is in complete opposition to that. So.
And I think that's incredibly insightful, Robert. Maybe if you could tell us a little bit about how the kind of experience that the coalition has had in engaging with Mcmining. Yeah, I think that's also just going to kind of help us contextualize our discussion further.
Well, thank you very much. And I would say that there's kind of a periodization of different phases of different master main tactics or main strategies. But however, throughout the whole period, I mean, including up till now, it's always been multi-pronged. So, for example, and particularly during the litigation phase, which is the first phase, but not exclusively so, there's been significant engagement with the media, including creating our own like multimedia content, just also portraying the beauty and the significance of Mapungubwe and threat, etc. So there's always been advocacy and to back up other interventions. But the first kind of phase was attempting to challenge the mining rights and other authorizations through both procedurally and substantively through internal appeals and litigation, which was very multi-pronged because it also included an interdict to suspend an interim interdict to suspend activity pending the determination of all the different challenges. And initially, it did seem like there was possible success of an effective multimedia campaign. Also, I think as has already been stated by it's already been stated by Diane in his very able introduction that a lot of the challenges and the media releases, as well as regulatory action from the department when the company was operating outside of licenses it already had, was that those impacts, those stories, those challenges, and that did seem to be correlated with declines or sharp reductions in Mcmining or coal Africa than share prices. So initially those signs were in many ways encouraging, but and also in the initial phase after the mining right had been issued, the initial stance of say key regulators like the then water department, now the DWS and the environment department, were not issuing licenses initially. I mean, licenses came later in 2011, but in 2010 they were initially opposed. But unfortunately, they were, I think, through an immense amount of lobbying. In fact, there were and internal lobbying, but also probably also corporate lobbying, and they were moved. They eventually changed their stance and issued water and issued licenses and environmental authorizations, and also in the midst of it, Mcmining had been doing it started to do a lot of, particularly after the mining right, started a lot of construction and that. And it was a difficult, and where that goes in as part of our application was an interdict application. And interdicts, one of the biggest factors in granting them is balance of convenience. And when a lot of capital has been sunk into a project, that argument gets eroded. Plus, it was getting much more difficult because at one point we were opposing a mining right. Now we're opposing 3 different licensing departments. And so it was decided that the prospects of success were not that high in court, and it was decided at least an attempt to pursue negotiations with Coal of Africa on a couple of things, which I'll state some of them, not all of them. One of them is the terms of reference of the environmental monitoring body in terms of the authorizations, known as the Environmental Management Committee, EMC, and its subcommittees. So that was one aspect. Others, just in general, negotiating improvements to the initial licenses, so that deficiencies are addressed and a high standard is required given the special sensitivity of the site. So that commenced in about October 2011, if I'm not mistaken, and then But that didn't last long, because one of the other aspects of the terms of the agreement was that a riparian and wetland specialist was commissioned, paid by Coal of Africa, but independent, and would do monitoring. And for example, one of their reports showed that Coal had been doing activities involving basically water uses that weren't covered by the water use license issued by what's now DWAS, the RES, the Water Department. And there were other evidences of other similar activities that were very indications of bad faith, and so the coalition could not continue with the negotiation process. However, and also the process of litigation remained, obviously, were the same factors that caused the abandonment of litigation still pertained, even though the negotiations didn't work. And so the one institution that was left, and which actually has been the bulk of the activity since, was the multi-stakeholder environmental management committee and the subject specialist water and heritage subcommittees. And I think it was a project of also testing those institutions that in theory are multi-stakeholder, but in practice are often just the company and the regulator. And so the coalition decided to enter that space and have representatives on and be there on the subcommittees and the main EMC. And I think the impact was felt quite soon, because initially at the initial meetings, the meetings were short and they were quite clubby between the company and the regulator, and the coalition started injecting spirit of critical questioning of the different monitoring reports that the mining company presented, and asking questions and also querying whether additional licenses are needed, and so I definitely think that it's been critical in holding the company to the high standard that's needed, given the sensitivity of the site. Obviously, what's also changed is that the quality of the coal was different to what was initially anticipated by mine. That's a whole story in itself. But the point is that the decision to go into care and maintenance, which has been extended far longer than due to a number of different factors. The site isn't as active and the risk isn't as present. However, we're always on the watch for and every now and then we do pick up something. Sometimes it seems to go smoothly, but we do pick up issues and ensure they're addressed. And also that the coalition in this space has ensured that this has continued operating, because the company have argued that it's not necessary given not to have much activity, and we've insisted that it's a condition of the environmental authorization and water use license, and that as long as the mine closure certificate hasn't been issued, and that these need to be continued, and we need to be vigilant. Maybe they can be more seldom, etc.
Yeah.
And so I think it's positive, but there are some negative. There's some things, the room for improvement I can speak about if there's still time.
Yeah, no, thank you, Robert. I think you've given us a real context of this company and just the length of time that it's taken to be able to get to certain stages, kind of opposing the environmental authorizations, etc. And what I'm taking away from you here is that, I mean, you've been doing this work since 2011. The IDC made its investment in Mcmining in 2017. This was such a public, visible campaign, multi-stakeholder, diverse, and surely the IDC should have considered the work that the coalition did. Just a basic due diligence, I guess, would have really revealed to them the extent of the objections to this particular company. I'm keen to ask you a few more questions, but I do want to give the other panelists a chance to also reflect on the questions that have been or will be posed to them. So I'd like to invite David Chizumba, and I've put his bio into the chat, into this conversation. And David, I think, firstly, you're doing such critical work and have been working with a number of different organizations and different stakeholders in doing this work. Can I start off by asking you, why is it important to you and to surrounding communities that this particular area be protected from mining?
All right, good morning, everyone. Just to start off, yeah, and I would say that the work that we've been doing, it's a matter of survival. Survival of the people, survival of the landscape, and the subsequent environment that we find ourselves in. So me and the other stakeholders that I've been involved with, we're trying to ensure the survival of the communities and the environment, because already we are faced with programs that are being proposed to the communities. So we see that it is important that we ensure that the people are given a voice and that the environment is also given a voice, because without it, we are nothing. So these are some of the challenges, or this is the main that we are facing ourselves with. Like the previous speaker has said, there is a water scarce region, and when we have proposed projects like the Makado project and together with Sina Makado, a special economic zone, you'll see the state will leave the land as a barren wasteland. So we do not want to see another highland being, Highveld being here at the Limpopo Valley. So that is why we are working very hard to ensure and get the message out there that we do see another Highveld here in Limpopo, and that is why we are making sure and we're working with and partnering with different stakeholders to ensure that we do not have another Highveld here and don't have our land desiccated. Another thing,
I think we've lost David, and so we'll try and have him join on the phone. If you can just give us a second to be able to have him join on the phone, and I'm sure you'll be able to hear him a lot clearer as well. Hi, David, are you back? We just want to test your connection. Alternatively, we can call you on your cell phone and perhaps continue the conversation on your phone. David? Okay, so maybe what we can do is while we wait for David, Dion, I see there's a question for you in the chat about the IDC Act. Could you answer that question, and I will try and get David on his cell phone. Thank you, Dion.
Sure, let me just follow up in the chat here. So see, yeah, one of the recommendations of the report is a revision of the mandate of the IDC to be aligned with constitutional obligations and international standards. Will this require an amendment of the IDC Act? So yeah, in the recommendations, we do suggest that Parliament reviews the IDC Act to make its own determination on that point. But it could definitely be amended with to align the long title or the purpose of the Act to include the word sustainable, to ensure that the IDC supports sustainable industrial development and not just industrial development. And also the objects of the IDC. There are a list of 8, I think it might be 8 objects in the Act. and none of those objects focus on sustainability. So some of the other objects might be, for example, realizing or supporting Black economic empowerment, or small and medium and micro enterprises. And what we're suggesting is that an additional object could be included in the Act to include a focus on sustainability. Once sustainability is incorporated in the Act, we might find that the IDC and the Department of Trade and Industry take more concrete steps to realize the objective of achieving sustainability, which necessarily means formulating policies that align with social and environmental and climate-related standards. And we've seen this with the Development Bank of Southern Africa, for example, who performed much better than the IDC in our previous assessment. And with the DVSA, the DVSA Act specifically explains that sustainability must be taken into account. So I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Leon. Thank you very much. I see there are some other questions as well. And we have David on the line. David, so you were telling us about why it was important to you and surrounding communities that you address mining in the region. Can you quickly recap for us what your answer was, as we couldn't really hear you? And then maybe you can tell us about the cumulative impacts of mining in Limpopo, particularly the area that you work in, given the MCES project, the Mikado mining project, and now the new mining rights which have been granted. Over to you, David.
Okay, thank you, Leanne. So as I was saying before I was cut, is that the fight is about survival of the people and the land, because without the land, you cannot have a people. So we've seen that these developmental projects are going to threaten the livelihoods and the essence of life to the Bavenda people. So that is why we are bringing this fight. Just to also give you a highlight, as I've said, is that the water is a big problem in the area. The World Bank recently, the World Bank's 2030 resources group, water resources group, has warned that by 2030 in South Africa, there will be a 17% gap between supply and demand. And if we were to then, for these projects, these coal mines in the Mikado special economic zone are given the green light, already in a water-stressed area, it means it's just going to be pandemonium. It's going to be disastrous. Already in the region, there's so many communities that are without water, and it baffles the mind that projects will be approved and given approval where there are heavy water users, but communities do not have water, and water is prioritized for these projects. So this then brings a question to where does the priorities in terms of government, where does the government's priorities lie? So that is why we are saying that these projects are very detrimental, and as the communities are going to have so much impact. And one thing that is often overlooked is the spiritual connection to the water and the land that the people have, which is something that is never ever highlighted or is never even given any importance, which is really, really disingenuous, and it does a great disservice to the people. Because as the people, as the Bavenda people, we are very still rooted in our culture and our traditional beliefs. So there are so many sacred sites that are not documented, that are not recognized nationally, but still hold importance to the people and the communities, the people of the area. So when you have these projects, they do not respect the traditions, they do not respect the sacred sites, they do not respect the ancestral burial lands of the people, and they go there and they just continue developing and continue digging up, which is the case that we had with Coal of Africa, when they said they would like to relocate a graveyard. And that is something that is inconceivable, and you can't even begin to imagine in African culture and in the culture. But these projects, when they come, they propose such outrageous plans in terms of what they call their mitigation. So for us, it is very worrying that we have we have a public funder like the IDC funding such projects that do not take people's rights into consideration. They do not take people's culture into consideration. So it is very, very worrying that we have such things happening. So also another problem is when these projects come, they come with development, they come with the premise of give jobs. But in most instances, what we see is that a lot of community members are left behind in these developmental or these set developmental parameters. So as community members on the ground do not end up reaping the benefits, and it's something that is it's a big contentious issue. So we see that these problems, all of these problems put together, outweigh the benefits that these people or these projects are proposing. So the cumulative impact of the Mcmining Special Economic Zones is going to lead to a mushrooming of mines in the Sultan's region. This is already a biodiversity hotspot. It is recognized internationally by the UN under the Biosphere Reserve, where the vendor is recognized as the vendor Biosphere Reserve. So it is already going to have a huge impact on the biodiversity, because already, as I've stated, this is a biodiverse hotspot. So if you're going to have mines going to be mushrooming up in the region, it's going to lead to a huge environmental disaster in terms of the biodiversity impact. Yeah.
And David, maybe tell us a little bit about your experiences in challenging Mcmining, formerly Coal of Africa, and what Solve and local communities will be doing to oppose future developments, given the immense impact that you have highlighted.
Yeah, so with my experiences, a very long road with the fight to Coal of Africa, and as Solve, together with the different communities, at first when this Coal of Africa came in, it came under the guise of development, and there was a lot of community buy-in. But the moment as an organization started questioning them and requesting information, we started seeing many contradictions from their presentation, because as we attended the public participation meeting, we raised these issues of the sacred sites, the grave relocation, and the water. And in each of these public participation meetings, we never got conclusive answers. Otherwise, we never even got answers. So we then saw that it is important that we go to these communities and we find out and also educate them in terms of what will happen or what are the consequences of allowing them to start with their operations. And in the end, it was not an easy fight. It was a very long fight. We had conflict in the community. One community, the Mcmining community, till this day is still divided. You have the coal mining and the group that is also against the mine. So what we saw, or what has happened, is that when these companies came in, they divided communities. But luckily enough, we got the support, and the people started understanding by us going into the community, giving them the information, giving them other case studies, and giving them other examples in different areas where such proposed projects were proposed and given the green light, and all these promises were made but were not kept. And in us doing that, it led us to gain or make strong connections with communities that we still work with till this day. And it gained or gave us an insight as to what are the problems and challenges that communities are facing. So in all my experiences, this led us to also understanding the spiritual and cultural attachment that communities have to the land, and also how they would also like to see their land being developed, how they wouldn't necessarily want outside investors coming in and leading development in the area, but they would also want to self-actualize and be given an opportunity to see themselves being the drivers of change, the drivers of development in a way that respects their culture and the environment. So those are the experiences. Some could say that, or I could say that it brought us together as the community in the Sultan's Valley, because we had people from Tando, we had people from Messina coming together and being in a united voice, coming under one united voice to say, no, we do not want coal mines. These are the negative impacts, and we would like to charter an alternative which will make sure that it is sustainable, but also mainly respect the cultural and traditional attachment that we as the Bavenda people, as the Bavenda community have towards the land and the environment.
Thanks so much, David. I mean, I'm hearing from you that, as Solve and together with local communities, you'll continue as a united front to be able to oppose future developments. And I guess, what you've described, and it's been such an incredible journey, a difficult journey that you've described, is that a lot of the concerns and the considerations that should be taken into account are not reflected in final EIA reports, for example. And there's a question of, should the IDC, in making an investment in a particular coal mining company like Mcmining, formerly Coal of Africa, try to meet with communities directly, try to understand the real issues that are not always reflected clearly by the corporation.
Yes, you hit the nail on the head right there, because mostly we find that these decision makers are sitting 400, 500 kilometers away from the community, and they are making boardroom decisions and have not been on the ground. So if they were to come to the community, sit down with the community, speak with the community, they will understand why there is resistance and pushback into this project that they are funding. Because they are in Johannesburg or in Cape Town or wherever, they do not understand why people are saying no. They do not understand, or when these things are put in the report, like the spiritual attachment and the spiritual importance, it is not done. In the recent public participation meetings, we've highlighted to the EAP, the environmental practitioner, that even the definition from the South African Heritage Council of what secret sites are in Venda it's not correct. It does not properly characterize or define what secret sites are in Venda, and that is because when these definitions or when these things are put out in reports and acts, nobody takes the time or nobody bothers to come and consult with the communities to understand the essence, to understand what it actually means. So it leads to a lot of mischaracterization of the issues on the ground. So it would do them a great service to come to the communities, find out, sit down with us so that we can tell them straight from the horse's mouth, and they would understand our issues and our reservations when it comes to such projects.
Thank you, David. This is such an interesting conversation. I think we could really talk about this all day and really unpack the intricacies of what you're saying and the solutions as well. But I would just say, thank you for sharing today the experiences that you've had. David, I'm going to keep you on the line, as I'm sure there will be questions for you, but I want to hand over to Alia. Alia, I see that there's already a question in the chat that I think you can address as part of our conversation, which is what will or can be done to compel the IDC to take on the recommendations in the report. But I think before we get to that question, maybe tell us, why is it important to focus on development finance institutions and public finance for climate risky projects such as coal mining? Why a focus on public finance to advance environmental and climate justice?
Thanks, Leanne. And I'd like to start by appreciating the inputs that have been made before me, because they have, I think, really contextualized the reason of focusing on climate risky projects in particular. And hopefully I'd like to articulate the importance of public finance institutions within this. And so I don't repeat what has been said already by Kier, Stayan, David, Robert. I think an important consideration for us to unpack is the nature of risk itself. So if we actually question the mandate of public financial institutions to de-risk projects, if we ask who really carries the risks, what are the risks, and how are these risks understood and mitigated, it really pulls into question the mandate that financial institutions have, especially public financial institutions. So what we really are asking by focusing on this topic in particular is that we cannot let the impacts that the speakers before me have described, we cannot let these impacts be left to policy loopholes that Kees has mentioned. So when we look at the mandate to de-risk, we look at the risks that we are being faced with at the moment. The climate crisis in particular is changing the nature of risk when it does come to traditional industrial investments that the IDC would be an active player in. So when we look at the environmental responsible policies and the environmental policies that the IDC does have, it just exemplifies that this is something that is being spoken about. There is increasing awareness, but what we need to look at is, are these enough? Which is what the case study is actually asking. So if we do ask the question, is the IDC's mandate fulfilled in de-risking? Yes, it is, but is it in line with the constitutional and legislative rights for an environment that is safe for citizens? Well, I don't think so. Because if we look at the actual due diligence process that the IDC has, the first step would be to consider the broad industrial assessment, with the second step looking at the developmental impacts. Now, if we question the outcomes of this due diligence process, using coal mining as an example, it actually implies that the commercial viability, the predominant investment criteria, would actually be enough to tackle the environmental and social risks that materialize. When we look at what's actually being considered, it's not necessarily an action by the beneficiary or the client of the IDC to address the risks at play. It's actually looking at a description of what risks there will be and what plans are actually being mentioned, but not actual action. There is no actual policy or commitment from the enabling funding body to oversee and track those risks and how they're being managed. So if that is the actual process, why is that not enough? Coal, then, as the example in question, and fossil fuel mining are the root of the climate crisis. And so further investment, we're not talking about maintaining about old plants and fossil fuels. We're actually talking about new investments now, actually entrench citizens to further and future extreme weather conditions through climate change, which is then set to worsen our triple threat challenges of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. So the risk is paramount, and this is not just a financial risk if you look at the investment criteria. This actually then introduces unsustainability and looking at who carries the cost, particularly if the funder does not take these into consideration. Those who are most impacted, being mining affected communities, as David has explained, would be the ones carrying that risk. So the policies within that regard are not enough to actually de-risk the actual risks that we face. The environmental and social impacts of mining historically are well known and are not resolved either through this funding, where we look at where that risk generally falls, which is in the mandate of then the DMRE, that governs then policies and regulations such as the Minerals, Petroleum and Resources Development Act. And looking at the track record of South Africa in that regard is evidence in itself that that risk is not being adequately addressed. Again, the risk becomes devolved to communities primarily affected, and those then who are actually exposed to the harmful emissions of a coal mine in particular. Again, this also threatens the long-term viability of the project itself, and again, not in line with the IDC's mandate of funding sustainable industries. Again, with the international trends of de-risking in fossil fuels and actually becoming unprofitable, the IDC itself then sits with the financial risk, which then puts the question out into the public, is it able to actually finance sustainable alternatives if it is sitting with the financial burden of unprofitable projects such as Mcmining? So to just wrap that up, in their mandate to financially de-risk development projects and actually support sustainable industries, investing in Mcmining is out of line with the IDC's mandate and actually opens up the institution itself to risk, but devolves the physical risks to communities in the area and those who would be exposed to harmful emissions and then impacts of climate change. And it actually then provides the basis for campaigns such as 350s to make a deliberate policy commitment to divest from fossil fuels entirely, so that instances such as this one are not left to a policy loophole. And we can actually then ensure that public institutions such as the IDC then make deliberate redirections of finances to sustainable alternatives.
Incredibly interesting, Alia. I mean, you know, the campaign that 350 has in relation to public finance, I think partially answers the question that has been asked around what do we do now? You know, we have a report like this, we've unpacked what the risks are, we've unpacked what the potential solutions are, whether it's the IDC, you know, bolstering its responsible investment policy and committing to stop funding fossil fuels, or, you know, a range of other recommendations that we've highlighted. Can you take me through the kind of support that is necessary to advance 350's campaign in relation to the public financing for fossil fuels, and maybe some examples? I seem to recall, you know, the need to engage with Parliament, for example, and other practical steps that we should be taking in ensuring accountability, but I would say meaningful engagement around these issues. If you could reflect a little bit around those questions.
Thanks, Leanne. I think it is important to realize then the role that public financial institutions play in advancing climate and environmental justice and social justice within that as well. It is actually to acknowledge that the role that they have has a tipping point effect, considering their sphere and influence in financing, in meeting developmental objectives, and their sphere of influence with the private sector as well. So in terms of advancing social justice, environmental justice, and climate justice, it is to recognize that they do have not only this opportunity, they have this responsibility as well to advance the Sustainable Development Goals, to set standards of best practice when their primary mandate is not profit, but actually development. And so to recognize that undermining sustainable development is actually a real danger that they pose should we not focus on development financial institutions. But they also have an opportunity to contribute to policy and regulatory processes, which is why some of the previous activities in the past have been to engage parliamentary bodies in justifying and backing up this position that we are demanding to divest from fossil fuels. Very important research around subsidies of fossil fuels in the past actually highlight then the historic and deliberate financial flows to building up a fossil fuel industry. So when it comes to what we need to do to advance the position that we hold, it is actually to unpack and bring to light the historical role that public financial institutions have played, and use this as a linchpin to actually change and transform and demand transformation within the sector as well. So in terms of advancing, as you've asked, in justice, it is also to really challenge the economic growth model and the development model that has been spoken about before that are arguably not working. It is to, again, emphasize, articulate, and bring to the fore of these conversations that the development model that we have, that the IDC continues to work with, is leading to and exacerbating continued unequal development through fossil fuels. Because when we look at what we need to support justice, it really is about bringing to the forefront the unequal nature of negative impacts and who then benefits from continued fossil fuel mining, but who really carries the cost and the risk. So when looking at what we need, it is a paradigm shift in financing through the development institutions, which is where then we sit as a coalition and civil society, to say that the DFIs need to use their sphere of influence and in the sector, and they have the procedural duty and the historical responsibility to actually transform. And when it comes to what we actually need to do, I do believe it is up to civil society to actually bring these details, bring this process to light in a way of empowering ourselves and supporting communities that are actually being disempowered by this process, and challenge this institution that is publicly and should be publicly accountable.
Thanks so much, Alia. I think we all have a role to play in supporting the work that 350 is doing around public finance. Whether it's signing on to some of the letters and the petitions that you regularly circulate, or providing some sort of insight from the sectors, the various sectors that are perhaps represented on this call, to be able to say, look, here are different perspectives that could be included as we continue to challenge fossil fuels. And I think this is especially relevant as we move into challenging gas as the fossil fuel being relied on as part of as being a transition fuel. So I'd really just like to give everyone a chance, to perhaps make some closing comments, but also check that we haven't missed any questions that have been asked here. I think there are a lot of comments in the chat around capitalism and rethinking what development means. And, to David's point, where communities recognize that self-actualization is really important, our development models are not necessarily taking into account what matters and what is going to be meaningful development within communities. It does seem as if we have answered all the questions. I think just to add to what Alia has said around how we compel the IDC, I think we are continuing to engage with them, and we remain open to continued engagement. And perhaps because we lost a few minutes with David's presentation, David, can I ask you to close off the discussion with a very brief point around the way forward and how people can maybe support Solve in the work that they're doing?
Okay, thank you, Leanne. Well, I think the way forward right now, as you have highlighted, is the importance of giving communities a chance to self-actualize. We need to move away from how things have been done in terms of how development or how the way we perceive development, and chart a new way. And that will go a long way in advocating and realizing the just transition, where the minority or the marginalized community are not left behind, but are active participants. So, and just to keep it short, that's how we should view this thing, and that's how we should take the fight to the status quo. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. And thank you to all our panelists and all those who have joined us today. We really just wanted to aim to end on time. Dayan, for your excellent presentation. We encourage all of you to go and have a look at our report, continue supporting the work of 350 around public finance institutions, remain with us in this fight against the continued support for fossil fuels. Thank you, everyone. We'll end the chat there. And we look forward to any emails or further engagement around the report outcomes. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.